There's a painting most Americans have seen without really seeing. Emanuel Leutze's Washington Crossing the Delaware, the general standing heroically in a boat, his men rowing through ice toward destiny. It hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's been reproduced on everything from postage stamps to classroom walls. But here's what the painting doesn't show. Washington's troops were starving. Their boots were falling apart. Many had no boots at all. And the reason they were crossing that frozen river on Christmas night wasn't just tactical brilliance, it was financial desperation. The Continental Army was days away from dissolving because Congress couldn't pay them. The revolution was never just about ideas. It was about insolvency. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where we examine the forces that actually move history, and today we're dismantling the most sanitized myth in American education, that this country was founded on philosophical principles alone. The truth is messier, more cynical, and infinitely more interesting. America wasn't born from a declaration. It was purchased on credit, assembled through speculation, and financed by powers who saw the colonies not as freedom fighters, but as a profitable disruption. The real story of American independence isn't found in Philadelphia's Independence Hall. It's buried in the ledgers of Amsterdam banks, the warehouses of Havana, and the secret accounts of French aristocrats who bankrolled a rebellion they didn't believe in, because they believed in something else entirely, destroying Britain. Let's start in 1763, 13 years before anyone signed anything in Philadelphia. Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, what Americans call the French and Indian War. On paper, it was Britain's greatest triumph. They'd crushed France in North America, secured vast territories, and established themselves as the dominant imperial power. But victory came in with an invoice that nearly bankrupted the kingdom. Britain's national debt had doubled to £133 million, an astronomical figure that would take decades to service. The interest payments alone consumed nearly 60% of government revenue. The British Parliament looked at this mountain of debt and made what seemed like a logical decision. The colonies should contribute to their own defense. After all, British troops had protected them from French expansion. British ships guarded their coastlines. British diplomacy secured their borders. Why shouldn't colonists share the burden? From London's perspective, this was basic fiscal responsibility. From Boston's perspective, it was theft. But here's the critical detail most textbooks gloss over. It wasn't the taxes themselves that broke the system. Colonial tax rates, even after the Stamp Act and Townshend duties, remained lower than those paid by citizens in England. What shattered the relationship wasn't the amount of taxation, it was the sudden disruption of an economic arrangement that had worked for over a century through strategic neglect. Before 1763, the colonies operated in a state of benign financial autonomy. Yes, they were technically bound by mercantilist navigation acts. Yes, they were supposed to trade exclusively through British channels. But enforcement was lax. Smuggling was rampant, and colonial assemblies controlled their own internal finances. The system worked because everyone was breaking the rules just enough to profit. Then, Britain tightened the screws. Suddenly, customs officials actually showed up to enforce trade restrictions. Vice Admiralty courts stripped colonists of jury trials in commercial disputes. Royal governors began vetoing colonial legislation that interfered with revenue collection. And most explosively, Parliament asserted absolute authority to tax the colonies without colonial representation. This wasn't just political overreach. It was an economic disruption that threatened to reshape the entire colonial business model. Merchants who'd built fortunes on smuggling French molasses suddenly faced bankruptcy. Planters who'd operated on credit, extended by colonial assemblies, found that credit drying up as British authorities demanded hard currency. A financial ecosystem that had evolved over generations was being dismantled by bureaucrats in London who'd never set foot in America. But nothing, and I mean nothing, destabilized colonial society more than Britain's stranglehold on currency itself. Ask most Americans what sparked the revolution, and they'll mention tea. Some will reference the Stamp Act. A few might recall taxation without representation. Almost none will mention the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, and yet these pieces of legislation did more to radicalize colonial merchants and planters than any other British policy. Here's why. The colonies were forbidden from issuing paper money as legal tender for debts owed to British creditors. Let that sink in for a moment. The colonial economy needed a medium of exchange to function. Wages had to be paid, goods had to be traded, debts had to be settled. But Britain refused to supply enough coinage and simultaneously banned colonists from creating their own monetary substitute. The result was predictable and catastrophic: deflation. When there's insufficient money circulating in an economy, prices fall. That might sound positive until you realize what it actually means. Farmers couldn't sell crops at profitable prices. Merchants couldn't move inventory. Wage earners saw their purchasing power collapse as employers lacked the currency to pay them. And everyone holding debts, particularly debts to British creditors denominated in pounds sterling, faced ruin as the money needed to repay those debts became increasingly scarce. Modern economists call this a liquidity trap. Colonial Americans called it suffocation. Benjamin Franklin testified before Parliament in 1766, attempting to explain the crisis. He described how the Currency Act had created such poverty that colonists literally could not acquire the currency needed to purchase British goods or pay British taxes, defeating the entire purpose of the legislation. His testimony was ignored. Parliament saw only fiscal discipline. Colonists experienced economic strangulation. And here's where class interests and revolutionary fervor converged. This crisis affected everyone, but it especially threatened the colonial elite, the very men who would lead the revolution. George Washington owed £1,800 to British merchants. Thomas Jefferson's debts exceeded £10,000. Nearly every prominent planter in Virginia was leveraged to London creditor houses, with obligations they had no realistic means of satisfying. The tobacco economy that sustained Southern aristocracy was collapsing under the weight of falling prices, currency restrictions, and mounting debts that could not be renegotiated or repaid. Independence offered something incredibly valuable: a reset button. This doesn't diminish the ideological commitment of the founders. Jefferson's rhetoric about natural rights was sincere. Washington's dedication to liberty was genuine. But we make a serious mistake if we imagine these men as philosopher kings detached from material concerns. They were investors, speculators, and entrepreneurs whose economic futures were being crushed by a system that gave them no financial autonomy and no path to solvency. Liberty and liquidity weren't separate motivations. They were two sides of the same coin, literally. When you read the Declaration of Independence through this lens, certain passages take on new meaning. The complaints about Parliament imposing taxes without consent weren't just about political theory. They were about an economic elite, watching their power being systematically dismantled by distant bureaucrats. The protest against royal governors dissolving colonial assemblies wasn't merely procedural. Those assemblies controlled local finances, credit systems, and currency issuance. The revolution wasn't a rebellion against tyranny as an abstract concept. It was a rebellion against a specific form of financial control that had become intolerable to the people who mattered most, the men with the resources to sustain a war. But sustaining a war required something none of them possessed: money. Actual, spendable, internationally recognized money. And that's where the story gets truly fascinating, and where American mythology completely falls apart. Let me be blunt. The American Revolution would have failed in 1776 without foreign money. It's not speculation. It's not revisionism. It's arithmetic. When the Continental Congress declared independence, they had no treasury, no tax base, no credit, and no military worth the name. Washington's army was a collection of poorly trained militias with mismatched weapons, insufficient ammunition, and no supply chain. The colonies couldn't manufacture gunpowder in sufficient quantities. They couldn't produce muskets at scale. They couldn't even clothe their troops adequately. Congress tried printing currency, the famous Continentals, but without gold or silver backing, these bills collapsed in value almost immediately. By 1781, the phrase "not worth a Continental" had entered the language as a synonym for worthlessness. Soldiers were being paid in scrip that merchants refused to accept. Officers resigned because they couldn't feed their families. Entire regiments threatened mutiny over unpaid wages. The revolution was bleeding out, not from British bullets, but from financial anemia. Enter the empires. France didn't support American independence because Louis XVI admired democratic principles. He was an absolute monarch. Democracy threatened everything he represented. Spain didn't fund the rebellion out of sympathy for colonial rights. They were a colonial power themselves, nervous about setting precedents. The Dutch didn't extend credit because they believed in self-determination. They were bankers. These powers financed the American Revolution for one simple reason. It was an opportunity to cripple Britain without risking their own armies. The operation began in 1776, months before independence was declared, with one of history's most audacious financial schemes. The French foreign minister, Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, couldn't openly fund a rebellion against Britain. Not yet. France and Britain were technically at peace. But Vergennes understood that wars could be fought with ledgers as effectively as with soldiers. So he created a front company. Rodrigue Hortalez and Company appeared on paper as a legitimate commercial trading firm, registered in Paris, engaged in ordinary international commerce. In reality, it was a covert financing operation designed to funnel French military aid to the American colonies while maintaining plausible deniability. The mastermind running this shell corporation wasn't a general or a diplomat. He was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, better known to history as the playwright who wrote The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro. Beaumarchais was perfect for the role. He was flamboyant, connected, financially sophisticated, and completely unscrupulous. Through his fake company, French gunpowder, muskets, artillery, uniforms, and gold flowed into American ports, disguised as commercial shipments. Ships left French harbors carrying textiles and wine that were actually cannons and ammunition. Bills of lading listed agricultural equipment that turned out to be military tents and bayonets. By 1777, Approximately 90% of the gunpowder used by the Continental Army came from French sources funneled through Beaumarchais' operation. When Washington crossed the Delaware, when Gates defeated Burgoyne at Saratoga, when Greene outmaneuvered Cornwallis in the South, all of it was possible because a French playwright turned arms dealer was cooking the books in Paris. But France wasn't the only player. Spain entered the game more cautiously. They couldn't openly support a colonial rebellion. They had their own restive colonies in Latin America to worry about. But they could provide financial support through intermediaries. Spanish silver flowed north from Havana through the Gardoqui family, merchant bankers with operations spanning the Atlantic. Diego de Gardoqui became America's secret lifeline, converting Spanish coin into continental credit, bribing British officials, and establishing supply routes through the Caribbean. The Spanish weren't investing in American freedom, they were investing in British humiliation. Every dollar they funneled to the Continental Army was a dollar that weakened their imperial rival. Strategic calculation dressed up as covert humanitarianism. Then there were the Dutch. Amsterdam in the 1770s was the financial capital of Europe, the center of international banking, credit markets, and speculative investment. Dutch merchant houses like Hope and Company and Willem and Jan Willink saw the American rebellion not as a cause, but as an instrument, a high-risk bond offering with extraordinary upside potential. These banks began purchasing American debt instruments at steep discounts, betting that if the colonies somehow won, those bonds would be redeemed at full value. They extended credit lines to continental purchasing agents in Europe, allowing Americans to buy supplies they couldn't afford. They legitimized American financial instruments in European markets, giving the rebellion a veneer of creditworthiness it absolutely did not deserve. The Dutch weren't doing this out of political sympathy. They were doing it because they'd correctly calculated that Britain was overstretched, that the war was unpopular in Parliament, and that even a long-shot bet on American victory offered asymmetric returns. If the colonies lost, Dutch bankers would write off the debt. If the colonies won, they'd own a significant stake in the finances of a new nation. Venture capital, 18th century style. But the most fascinating financial operators weren't the foreign governments. They were the Americans themselves, working in the shadows to convert European interest into tangible support. Silas Deane is almost completely forgotten today, but in 1776, he was arguably the most important American on Earth. Congress sent him to Paris as their first covert diplomat with a single mission: get money and weapons. Deane had no official credentials, no government backing, and no guarantee Congress would even honor the agreements he negotiated. He was essentially running a startup seeking Series A funding, except the startup was a country that didn't legally exist yet. Deane charmed Vergennes, cultivated Beaumarchais, negotiated contracts, arranged shipments, and kept the entire covert financing operation running. He was part diplomat, part con artist, part venture capitalist. And he succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, until Congress turned on him, accused him of financial impropriety, and destroyed his reputation. He died broke and bitter in London, having facilitated the transactions that made American independence possible. Then there was Robert Morris, the Philadelphia merchant prince, who essentially became America's one-man central bank. When Congress couldn't pay soldiers, Morris used his personal credit. When Washington needed emergency funds for the Yorktown campaign, Morris guaranteed the loans. When the continental currency collapsed, Morris's reputation was one of the few assets that still commanded trust in financial markets. Morris speculated aggressively, sometimes enriching himself in ways that blurred the line between patriotic service and profiteering. But without his financial networks, his international connections, and his willingness to personally guarantee debts that could have bankrupted him, the revolution collapses several times over. And then there's Haym Salomon, whose story is even more obscure but equally critical. A Polish Jewish immigrant with financial connections spanning Europe, Salomon operated in Philadelphia as a broker, converting foreign loans into usable currency. When French and Dutch funds arrived in the form of bills of exchange, essentially IOUs that had to be converted into coin, Salomon was the man who made it happen. He negotiated exchange rates, extended personal credit, and kept Washington's quartermaster supplied during the war's darkest periods. Salomon died impoverished, his loans to the government never fully repaid. No monument honors him on the National Mall. But the Continental Army that wintered at Valley Forge, survived at Morristown, and marched to Yorktown, did so because Salomon kept the financial machinery running when everyone else had given up. These men, French aristocrats, Spanish merchants, Dutch bankers, American speculators, were the revolution's true engine. Washington commanded armies, but they commanded credit, and in the end, credit won the war. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, Americans celebrated their unlikely triumph. But the hard truth was that the war hadn't made America free. It had made America obligated. The United States emerged from the Revolution owing approximately $75 million in foreign and domestic debt, an astronomical sum for a nation with no functioning economy, no tax system, and no unified government capable of raising revenue. France alone held claims exceeding $6 million. The Dutch held millions more. Spanish creditors expected repayment. And inside America, thousands of soldiers, merchants, and speculators held continental bonds and promissory notes they'd been told were backed by the full faith and credit of a government that had no credit. Winning independence meant inheriting a balance sheet designed for failure. And here's where the philosophical ideals of the revolution collided headlong with the brutal realities of international finance. Creditors don't care about your principles. They care about repayment. France didn't extend loans because they admired Thomas Jefferson's prose. They extended loans because they expected returns, financial and geopolitical. The immediate consequence was that American foreign policy became a negotiation with creditors, rather than an expression of sovereign will. France expected favorable trade arrangements and diplomatic support. Spain demanded territorial concessions and control over navigation rights on the Mississippi River, a demand that threatened to strangle Western expansion. Dutch bankers insisted on fiscal reforms and centralized revenue collection to ensure their bonds retained value. America didn't walk onto the world stage as a free actor. It walked on as a debtor negotiating from weakness. This tension shaped the entire constitutional period. The Articles of Confederation, America's first government, was essentially a bankruptcy protection scheme. The federal Congress had no power to tax, no way to compel states to contribute revenue, and no mechanism to honor its debts. Creditors grew increasingly nervous. Foreign governments questioned whether loans to America would ever be repaid. The Dutch market for American bonds collapsed. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 is usually taught as an ideological debate about federalism, representation, and rights. And it was those things. But it was also, perhaps primarily, a response to a financial crisis. The new Constitution created a federal government with the power to tax, regulate commerce, and assume state debts, specifically because creditors demanded it. The elegant system of checks and balances Americans revere today was also a credit enhancement mechanism designed to reassure European bankers that their investments were safe. Alexander Hamilton understood this better than anyone. His entire economic program, assumption of state debts, creation of a national bank, federal taxation, debt repayment schedules, was aimed at a single goal: establishing America's creditworthiness in international markets. Hamilton's famous Report on Public Credit opens with a simple premise: a national debt, properly managed, is a national asset because it binds creditors to the nation's success. Jefferson hated this vision. He wanted an agrarian republic free from financial entanglements, where citizens lived independently without reliance on banks, credit, or European capital. But Jefferson's vision required something America didn't have: the ability to survive without borrowing. Hamilton's vision accepted America's financial reality and built a system to manage it. The battle between Jefferson and Hamilton is taught as a philosophical disagreement about the soul of the nation. And it was. But it was also a debate about debt management strategies. Hamilton's side won, not because his arguments were more persuasive, but because the alternative was national insolvency. The consequences played out in brutal, ironic ways. To service its debts, the federal government needed revenue. That meant taxes, real, enforceable federal taxes. And when Treasury Secretary Hamilton proposed an excise tax on distilled spirits to raise revenue, frontier farmers in western Pennsylvania exploded in rage. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was America's first domestic uprising against its own government. And it happened because the country that had fought a revolution over taxation now needed to tax its own citizens to pay for that revolution. President Washington personally led troops to suppress the rebellion. The symbolism was devastating. The general who'd led Americans against British tax collectors was now enforcing American tax collection at gunpoint. The revolution had come full circle, and debt was the reason. Debt also constrained America's foreign policy in ways that shattered revolutionary idealism. When France, America's crucial wartime ally, called on the United States to honor its alliance obligations during the French Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s, President Washington refused. The Treaty of Alliance from 1778 was technically still in force. France had every right to expect American support, but America couldn't afford to join. The economy was too fragile. Trade with Britain, America's former enemy, was too valuable. Dutch credit was too important. Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation, effectively abandoning the ally that had made independence possible. France was furious. Diplomatic relations collapsed. But Washington had no choice, not because he was unprincipled, but because America's creditors and trading partners made choosing sides financially impossible. The lesson was clear: sovereign debt creates sovereign constraints. And beneath all of this, the financial architecture of the Revolution was creating something else entirely: a new American elite. The speculators who'd bought Continental bonds for pennies on the dollar made fortunes when Hamilton's assumption plan redeemed them at face value. The merchants who'd extended credit during the war became the nation's first bankers. The lawyers and financiers who navigated the transition from Confederation to Constitution became power brokers in the new system. America's revolutionary generation didn't just win independence, they engineered a financial transfer that concentrated wealth in the hands of those savvy enough to bet on the outcome. This wasn't corruption exactly, it was capitalism in its purest form, recognizing risk, providing capital when others wouldn't, and reaping rewards when the gamble paid off. But it created inequalities that troubled the revolution's egalitarian rhetoric. The soldiers who'd fought at Valley Forge received worthless script. The speculators who'd never fired a shot became wealthy. The war created winners, but not the winners who'd done the fighting. 249 years have passed since the Declaration of Independence, and American students still learn the revolution as a story of ideals triumphing over tyranny. The founders risked their lives for liberty. The Continental Army persevered through impossible odds. A new nation was born from the courage of ordinary people committed to an extraordinary idea. All of that is true, and none of it is complete. Because the pattern that made American independence possible, foreign powers financing insurgencies to weaken rivals, didn't end in 1783. It's the geopolitical playbook, refined and repeated across centuries. France financed American rebels to weaken Britain. Decades later, Britain financed Latin American independence movements to weaken Spain. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union turned this strategy into an art form, funding proxy conflicts across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. The rhetoric changed, the technology improved, but the underlying logic remained identical. Why fight your enemy directly when you can pay someone else to fight them? Today, we see the same pattern playing out in Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, and regions most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Great powers funnel weapons, money, and intelligence to local actors, shaping conflicts without committing their own troops. They justify these interventions with noble language, defending democracy, supporting freedom, protecting human rights. And sometimes those justifications are sincere. But the calculus beneath the rhetoric is always strategic. Destabilizing rivals is cheaper than defeating them. Proxy conflicts offer deniability, limit casualties, and provide leverage in diplomatic negotiations. The names change, the locations shift, but the pattern persists because it works. And here's the uncomfortable truth Americans rarely confront. The United States, the nation that now wrestles with the morality and consequences of foreign entanglements, was itself born through exactly this mechanism. America was the proxy conflict, the Continental Army was the insurgency, and French aristocrats, Spanish merchants, and Dutch bankers were the foreign powers betting on disruption. This doesn't make the revolution illegitimate. It makes it comprehensible. Nations don't emerge from abstract principles. They emerge when financial incentives shift, when creditors see opportunities, when rival powers calculate that funding rebellion costs less than fighting wars, and when economic structures become unsustainable. The American Revolution succeeded because Britain's enemies recognized an investment opportunity and France's treasury was willing to finance it. The ideals mattered. The battles mattered. The courage mattered. But without the money, none of it would have mattered at all. This is the story we don't teach in schools because it complicates the narrative. We prefer our history clean, our motivations pure, our founders untainted by financial considerations. We want to believe that ideas alone can change the world, that moral clarity is sufficient, that history bends toward justice through the force of argument. But history teaches something else, that material conditions shape outcomes more than speeches, that access to capital matters more than access to philosophy, and that nations rise when the math works in their favor. The American Revolution wasn't just a political break from empire. It was a financial realignment that rewired the global balance of power. It succeeded not because Americans were uniquely virtuous, but because they were uniquely positioned, geographically isolated from European conflicts, economically valuable enough to attract investment, and strategically positioned to damage Britain more than the investment cost. Washington crossed the Delaware. Jefferson drafted elegant prose. Franklin charmed French salons. But Beaumarchais shipped the gunpowder. Morris guaranteed the loans. Dutch bankers underwrote the bonds. And when the war ended, the debts remained, shaping American policy, constraining American choices, and binding the new nation to the very financial systems it had rebelled against. The dollar didn't just fund the revolution. It invented America. The country that emerged from independence wasn't simply the one envisioned in Philadelphia's philosophical debates, it was the one demanded by creditors, shaped by debt obligations, and constrained by financial realities that made certain choices possible and others impossible. And if you look carefully at the world today, at how power operates, how conflicts are fought, how nations rise and fall, you'll see the same forces still at work. Capital still flows toward opportunity. Creditors still demand structural reforms. Great powers still finance insurgencies. And nations still discover that independence comes with a price tag. History doesn't repeat, but its underlying mechanics, the relationship between money and power, debt and sovereignty, investment and influence, remain constant. The American Revolution was a masterclass in these forces. It showed that empires can be toppled without fighting them directly, that financial pressure can accomplish what armies cannot, and that new nations emerge not from declarations alone, but from the calculation of creditors willing to bet on their success. We celebrate July the 4th as Independence Day. We should also remember it as Settlement Day, the moment America's revolutionary debts came due, and the nation began the long negotiation between the ideals it proclaimed and the financial obligations it had incurred. Because in the end, the most important lesson of the American Revolution isn't that freedom triumphed, it's that freedom was financed. And the terms of that financing shaped everything that followed. That's the revolution they don't put on postage stamps. But it's the one that actually built this country. If this changed how you see American history, subscribe to the Wealth Files. We're following the money through every turning point in history, because the ledgers never lie.